All right, hi everyone. We're going to be talking about joints today. We'll be talking about the actual structures and some of the movements and the actions that occur at the joints. All right, so I'm going to hide me so you can get a better view of these pictures. All right, so basically I think this is fairly obvious, but two bones are going to come together at a joint. Okay, that's what it's called. Another term for a joint, and the one that you'll hear me often use, is articulation. Okay, so it's just another word for it. Basically, a joint or an articulation is simply a point of contact between two bones. And more specifically, as hopefully you can see in this image, these bones are actually going to be covered by that hyaline cartilage that you would have developed during, well, development as your bones were growing. And we often refer to that at this point as articular cartilage because it's in an articulation or it's in joint. But again, the actual type of cartilage is hyaline cartilage. Another type of joint that we'll end up seeing is between your teeth and then the actual bone in either your mandible or your maxillary bone in your skull. Okay. And kinesiology is simply the study of motion. So here's an example of this synovial type of joint, synovial cavity. We mentioned that term at the very beginning of these PowerPoints. So there's a space between these two bones. It's filled with this fluid, so you can kind of see this joint cavity contains something called the synovial fluid that basically keeps everything nice and lubricated and moving smoothly. Okay. We can either classify joints based on their structure, so their actual makeup, or on their function, or a combination of the two. Okay, so structurally, they're either going to be something called fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial, and we'll talk about each one of those in a second. And then functionally, they are either immovable, meaning that there's no movement in that joint. However, two bones do come together. So the other fancy science word for that is synarthrosis. When it's slightly movable, there's a little bit of wiggle in there, we call that amphiarthrosis. And then when it's freely movable, so you have lots of movement, and really most of the things that we really, like in everyday speak, think of as joints, are going to be this type, and that's called a diarthrosis. So again, these are the scientific terms for that. Please make sure you know those. Okay. So let's take a look at the first structural type. So that's going to be a fibrous joint. Here are some different examples of a fibrous joint. Basically, these do not have a synovial cavity. The bones are held together by connective tissue. And again, there's very little or no movement at all. So either it's an amphiarthrosis or a synarthrosis. And the three different types we tend to see, the first type is this image right up here, are the sutures between your skull bones. So basically, as you grow up as an adult, there is no movement between those bones, but obviously, as you saw in lab and in the previous lecture, there are different bones in your skull coming together. You have what are known as syndesmoses. So here's an example of a syndesmosis between the tibia and the fibula, and there might be some tiny, slight movement, but for the most part, really not much at all. Another specialized term is something called a gomphosis. It's a special case of a syndesmosis, and that is reserved for basically the tooth sitting in the socket of either your mandible or your maxilla, so sitting in that alveolar process. Okay. Another type of fibrous joint is something called an interosseous membrane. So here's this sort of webbing-like sheet that you can kind of see filling in the space between the tibia and the fibula. So that would be the case of an interosseous membrane. Okay, so it's basically fibers, again, holding these things in. Second type is something called a cartilaginous joint. Again, does not have a synovial cavity, also allows very little or basically no movement. And in this case, remember, the ends of bones are going to be covered by hyaline cartilage. However, what's connecting them will be fibrocartilage, so that tougher type of cartilage, right? And in this case, we have two different types of cartilaginous joints. We have synchondroses and then what's known as a symphysis. And this should definitely sound familiar to you from when we looked at the skeleton. So let's just take a look at a synchondrosis. So these are sort of classic ones, and you've actually seen these before. Okay, so in this case, the connecting material actually is hyaline cartilage. So in the case of like epiphyseal plates, so obviously a bone, and the thing that's connecting the two, I mean, technically this is a joint, even though it eventually will fuse into one bone. However, there's the epiphyseal plate is actually connecting these bone bits, the epiphyses to the metaphysis, and then the diaphysis. So in any case, that since they're being connected by this cartilage, it's considered a joint. Okay. In this case, we really hope that that's immovable, right? You don't want all of a sudden the head of your femur detaching from the rest of your leg. That would be very, very bad. Okay. The other place where you'll see this is between the ribs and the sternum. So you see these strips of cartilage connecting the sternum to the ribs. All right, the other type that you would have heard before is what's known as the symphysis, right? So for the one you would have heard about is this pubic symphysis in the front here that's connecting to pubic bones, right? Again, in this case, the ends of the articulating bones are covered with hyaline cartilage, but fibrocartilage is what's actually connecting them. So the actual kind of blue here, the pubic symphysis, is actually fibrocartilage. Now these are slightly movable. So you know this. I mean, your intervertebral discs are slightly movable. Your pubic symphysis, particularly in women, is slightly movable. There are actually special hormones that are released during pregnancy that, especially toward the end of the pregnancy, will make this even more movable, so that basically this opening can become even wider so the baby's head can fit through. Okay. Right. And then finally, the last sort of structural type is what's known as a synovial joint. This is the one we saw in that first slide. So in this case now we have, and again, these are going to be more freely movable joints. So again, these are more the things that we think of every day as sort of our joints, like when we talk of joint aches and pains. Okay. So here we have our synovial cavity. Again, we have this fluid in between. They've got it shaded yellow here for you. The articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage, as I mentioned earlier. And basically that fluid and that cartilage is there to help reduce friction between the bones and help absorb some shock. This is what you often hear of, a lot of times athletes, or, it just depends on, like, I guess the individual, like certain athletes or certain performers, like ballet dancers and stuff like that. A lot of times they'll have lots of joint aches and pains because this cartilage has worn away. And now you have bone rubbing on bone, and that causes a lot of friction, it causes irritation, and then it causes pain, inflammation, swelling, and pain. Right, so you can see this capsule around the joint. That's what you're seeing here. You would have seen this a little bit earlier in lab as well. You'll see that you have ligaments, particularly like in the shoulder and in the knee and even in the hip, that are making up part of this capsule. And then on the inside, you can hopefully see in red here, you have a special membrane, so a special type of epithelial tissue that lines the inside of the capsule, and it's going to be the synovial membrane that is actually producing the synovial fluid. Okay. It's going to contain this special slippery substance called hyaluronic acid, and that acid is going to be it's a type of acid, I should say. I guess let me kind of back up. It's not exactly like an acid, like it's not going to all of a sudden like break something down. It's not like a high pH kind of thing. It's simply the term for it. But basically what it is it is actually very slippery. It kind of has the consistency of egg white. If you ever work on a cadaver, or you ever see a surgery, knee surgery, anything like that, and when they puncture that synovial cavity, you'll see a fluid come out. It literally looks like egg white, like that kind of viscosity. So it's very slippery, reduces friction. The other thing that it does is, remember, cartilage is going to be avascular, so there's no blood vessels going to cartilage. So however, we have chondrocytes, so we do have cells there, and if you have living cells, they require oxygen, they require nutrients to stay alive. No matter how low their metabolic rate is, they need some fuel, right? So basically where they're going to get their oxygen and their nutrients from is actually from this hyaluronic acid, from this synovial fluid. So as it's being produced and as your joints are moving, so like for example in your finger joints, as you're moving, you're producing this the synovial fluid, and you're kind of massaging it into that that articular cartilage at the ends of your bones. Okay. At the same time that it's supplying oxygen and nutrients, it'll also help remove carbon dioxide and waste. And there's also phagocytic cells. So again, if you don't remember, phagocytic cells are going to gobble up any kind of debris, any kind of maybe small cartilage bits that just kind of flake off. Obviously, if it's a large piece or a large tear, a tiny little cell can't tackle that, and you'd actually have to go in and get surgery and have that surgically removed. Now, just a little bit of how synovial fluid also works. When you're not moving, so let's say you've been sitting for a long time, you've probably all had this, like, you've been sitting for a long time and you get up and, you're stiff, right? You kind of have to massage your joint. Well, one of the things that happens is as that fluid kind of just sits there because you haven't been moving, it kind of it becomes thicker, right? It becomes more viscous. So when it becomes more viscous, it's not quite as slippery, so your joints are actually stiff because you got this viscous fluid in there. So as you get up and you start moving, there's some heat, there's movement, you're kind of working it. It kind of reminds me of almost sort of like, do you ever decorate a cake and you have the frosting? You actually have to knead the tube a little bit to get it kind of more, smooth, so you can actually squeeze it out of there. It's very similar to that. So basically, as you move your joints, you're kneading this fluid, and as you do that, you apply heat, you apply movement, and it becomes more fluid, and you stimulate the synovial membrane to produce even more. So now your joints, you unstiffen yourself after a bit of movement. So anyway, that's one of the things that happens. All right, let's hide me again. Some of the other special features of a synovial joint, you'll see there's lots of extracapsular ligaments, so ligaments outside of the actual capsule. A couple of examples are there, the fibular and tibial collateral ligaments. I don't know if we've gone over this yet in lab or not, but these would be your lateral collateral and your medial collateral ligaments. That's the other term for them. You also have ligaments actually inside the capsule. So this would be your anterior cruciate ligament, the ACL, and your posterior cruciate ligament, PCL. I'm sure you guys have at least heard of those through just watching sports, classic sports injuries for lots of players. You also have what are known as discs or meniscuses or menisci in your knee. Basically, if you think back to what your femur looked like and what the tibia looks like, that femur really is, let me kind of bring back my image here, that femur really is fairly rounded, right? If you kind of remember, it has those condyles on it, and they're fairly rounded. Now, they're sitting on a flat shelf. That's very easy for that to kind of slide back and forth. So what this meniscus does is it forms a cup, so now that femur can't slide. Okay, so basically that's what the meniscus does. It also provides some cushioning there as well, but mostly it's going to help increase the stability of that knee. Okay. All right, it's going to hide me again. All right, so basically all I'm trying to say here is that obviously joints are going to be innervated, and basically the nerves that go to nearby muscles, they'll have branches that will also go to the joints to provide innervation to them. Okay, the joint capsule and the ligaments contain pain fibers. If you've ever sprained something, either torn a ligament or stretched it, you know it hurts, right? Because there are actual pain receptors there. Okay. Also, the blood supply that go to these joints, because there will be blood on the outer part, supplying that synovial membrane. The blood supply, the actual blood vessels, are just simply coming off. They're just simply branches from larger blood vessels feeding also the muscles nearby. So it's not like, I guess what I'm trying to say, there isn't a specific nerve or blood vessel that was just to the joint. They're more branches from blood vessels and nerves feeding the things around them, structures around them. So you probably have heard of sprains and strains. They're not mutually exclusive. The terms are just slightly different from one another. So basically when we talk about a sprain, what we're talking about is damage to the ligaments. Okay? And if you damage the ligaments, oftentimes you're going to damage nearby blood vessels. You'll see swelling, bruising, because you've damaged blood vessels. Now, a strain, usually we talk about either a torn muscle or partially torn muscle, or the tendon is injured. Now, sometimes the injury is so bad that you tear the tendon as well as ligaments around it. So you can have a strain and a sprain, right? But in general, like if you've only like damaged like the muscle, we consider that a strain. If you only damaged ligaments, we call that a sprain. Okay. Now, we won't see these in lab, but you should understand that they exist. Around your joints, you also are going to have what are known as bursa, these tendon sheets. Okay, and basically this is a kind of a nice image here. So as you have your patella here, and here's the femur, here's the tibia, you can see here are the muscles coming from the quadriceps, and here's they're attaching down to that tibial tuberosity. And what you see here is that you actually have these fluid-filled sort of sac right here, kind of looks almost like a little beanbag or something. And what it's doing is it's acting as a cushion. It's yet another thing that's going to help reduce the friction between basically the patella and the femur. So anywhere where you're going to have one of these tendons or a ligament coming in, you're going to have a bursa underneath them, so you don't have connective tissue rubbing right on top of bone. Excuse me, imagine like you have like a rope, and if you were just like rub that on something, after a while it would fray, right? However, if you put like a protective covering around it, right, that helps it glide, it would be less likely to fray. So that's basically the same idea between these bursa and tendon sheaths. They're there to protect these different connective tissues. Okay, and really it's just the shape of them that will distinguish between a bursa and a tendon sheath. So a bursa is more of like I mentioned, like a small little beanbag, a fluid-filled sac, and then a tendon sheath is a tube-like bursa that will wrap around tendons. Particularly, you find them in the wrist and the ankle, where a lot of these tendons come in together in a small space. And then you may have heard of bursitis, or someone you may know has had bursitis. It's simply whenever we said itis, it's inflammation. That's the ending that means inflammation. So in this case, it's inflammation of the bursa. All right, I will stop this lecture right here, and we'll pick up on another one. Again, if you have any questions on that, feel free to email me.